Hello, everybody, and welcome to your first lecture in historical geology. Glad you could be here with me. I'm, of course, your professor, Dr. Hurt, and we're going to be going through 4.5 billion, actually more than that, 13 billion years of history in this class. So 13 billion years of history compressed into only, what is this going to be, 16 weeks if you're in a 16-week course, I guess 8 week or 8-week course, but we're going to go through history very fast. So anyway, we're actually starting our first lecture today is not on historical geology, but it's actually on what is science, because I realize that a lot of people come into this class, they don't really know exactly what science is. So the goal of today is to define what is science. Now, of course, to define, I'll explain a little bit about where that word comes from, because actually to define, oops, I have to put my pen on here. Actually, to what it means to define, is this going to work here? Pen, here we go. Okay, so actually to define means, those of you who might know Spanish might know that define, the fin, actually means the end of or a limit, right? So when we talk about defining something, we're actually talking about establishing the limits, so the boundaries, right? So a lot of times you actually know what something is according to its boundaries, right? You know, think of the state of Texas. Could you understand the state of Texas if you didn't know where the boundaries of Texas were, right? So that's what defines a state. You know, that's what defines anything, is knowing where its boundaries are and where its limits are. So that's what we're going to do today. We're actually going to define science. That means we're going to show what are the limits of science, where does it end, where does it start, okay? So that's the main goal for today. Before we start that, just want to give you a brief introduction of who I am, since you're going to be spending however long, if this is a 16-week class or 8-week or summer class or whatever it is. I use the same lectures for different classes, but however long you're going to spend with me, I want to give you a little bit of introduction to who I am. So, and you have to give me a bio in your first syllabus quiz, right? So I have to give you a bio, but I was born and raised in Southern California, so there's a picture of Southern California down there. That's a big reason why I left. It's just because I kind of got bored of sitting in traffic for hours on end every day. But anyway, I did my BS there at UCLA and in geology, and then I did my PhD in Earth and Environmental Sciences at the University of Michigan. And my wife, there's my lovely wife, she got pretty cold in Michigan and wanted to go down south, so we are up here, or I should say actually down here in South Texas. We have, of course, you can see 3 children, and maybe we'll have more, I don't know. But there's an old picture of them. But anyway, there's the oldest one, Teresa, and Julia, and that's the youngest guy, Frankie. So there you have it. So anyway, first question, you got to get out your lecture assignment. Remember, you have to print out your lecture assignments. You have to have printed copies of your lecture assignments. Now, the first question you see on there is explain in your own words what it means that natural world is a cosmos and not a chaos, right? So that's what you should see as your first question right there. I don't have a physical copy in front of me, but there's the digital copy, right? So anyway, I want to talk about that first. So again, more etymology. Etymology means the history of words, where words and roots of words come from, okay? The word for cosmos, probably when you hear that word cosmos, you are probably thinking of something like outer space or something like that, right? And that's, of course, a word that we apply to refer to outer space and the universe. But really, it means more generally, what cosmos means is order or arrangement. Now, the reason that we use cosmos to refer to the universe is because the universe is ordered and arranged. It's an ordered universe. So there is order. It's not chaos. Now, you know what chaos means. Chaos, I showed 2 puzzles here, right? One is a puzzle of the solar system that's all put together. That's an order. It's ordered. And here's another puzzle that's just scattered, right? So that's chaos. Chaos and cosmos are actually both Greek words, and they derive, they're kind of meant to be opposites, basically, from their derivation in Greek. So cosmos and chaos are, you kind of hear the similar sound of them, right? They're supposed to be opposites, okay? So a cosmos is the opposite of a chaos. Okay, so that's an important fact about the universe. The universe, don't take it for granted, the universe is ordered. So we have order and arrangement in the natural world. That's why we can do science. If there was no order, there would be no science, because you couldn't make sense of the world. There'd be no sense. There'd be no intelligibility. There'd be no order, right? Just like imagine a jumble of letters. Imagine taking one of Shakespeare's plays and jumbling all the letters around, right? It would become a disorder, and that's what you would have. But because they're arranged and they're ordered, you can make sense of Shakespeare's writings, right, or his plays. So that's the same way the universe is. The universe is ordered. It has an arrangement, and that allows you to do science. The world, the universe, is ordered by rational and intelligible laws. So there are underlying principles that govern the universe, the natural universe, right, the natural world. And we, in science, what are we trying to do? We are trying to discover what those underlying principles are. So in physics, we're trying to understand gravity and laws of electricity and laws of thermodynamics and the laws that govern how the universe and the natural world operate. Okay, so that's ultimately what we're trying to do in science, right? The natural world is governed by the natural laws. That makes nature predictable. Okay, so I'm drinking a cup of coffee here, right? And you all know if I were to let go of this cup of coffee, what would happen? It would just fall to the ground, right? Because of the laws of gravity. It's not like sometimes I drop it and then it just transforms into a dragon and flies away, right? That never happens. Because we know what's going to happen, and we know what's going to happen because we have natural laws that govern the universe that allow us to predict what's going to happen. And wouldn't it be horrible if you couldn't predict what would happen? You think about that. So intelligence can understand the natural world. So another thing here is that the natural world is intelligible. The order that is inherent in the natural world means that it is intelligible. So that means an intelligence that you have, you're an intelligent creature, you're able to understand an intelligible system. So for example, going back to William Shakespeare and his writings, any writing, is intelligible, and intelligence can make sense of it. If you were to take his poetry and take his plays and jumble up all the letters, it would no longer be intelligible. But because of the order inherent in it, it makes it intelligible. And all that means that we can do science, okay? So we can't do science unless we have this intelligent ordering of the natural world. Okay, so a little bit about, actually before I have another question here on the lecture assignment. I ask you, what's the etymological root of science? So science comes from a Latin word. It means scientia. And scientia is kind of an interesting word. It means knowledge. It's Latin word for knowledge. And what's kind of interesting is there's another word that means knowledge in Latin called sapientia. Whoops, I'm getting all these. I'm sorry, these lines always show up on PowerPoint. I haven't figured out why they happen, so just get used to them. Sapientia also means knowledge. Okay, so what's the difference between sapientia and scientia? The difference is this. Sapientia translates more, it's knowledge, but it translates more to a knowledge or maybe like a wisdom. So, and it's an important distinction that we're going to talk about today, right? So there's knowledge and there's knowledge. So scientia knowledge is, the science knowledge is a knowledge of kind of like practical and everyday things, and maybe like the way that the natural world works, kind of a knowledge. Whereas sapientia is more like a wisdom. So, a wisdom is maybe a kind of knowledge, but it's a knowledge of kind of deeper things of life. You understand, it means you understand the meaning of life, or you understand things like love, or you understand human relationships, or so it's that kind of a knowledge, a wisdom kind of a knowledge. Whereas scientia, science, is a knowledge, but it's a knowledge of kind of more of like maybe an engineering or math or science knowledge, or a knowledge of how world works in an objective kind of way. So I hope you kind of can make that distinction, see the difference between a scientia and a sapientia knowledge. So in science, we're totally focused on scientia. We don't pay attention to sapientia. If you want to know sapientia, you have to go to what? Philosophy, art, humanities, things like that. Those study sapientia knowledge, right? We study scientia knowledge in science. All right, so going on to another thing, number 3, it says, what does it mean that science is empirical? So that's another thing I should explain really quick, but we kind of get into it as we study about the scientific method. But just to kind of give you basically empirical, and often you'll hear natural sciences like we study as being empirical sciences. So empirical means based on observation. Okay, based on observation. So anything that is empirical is going to be based off of observations, and that doesn't just mean things we see with our eyes. It means our experiences, our kind of more broad. Our experiences, our taste, our smell, our hearing. It's based on experience. Sometimes they use this other terms. It means. Well, I guess I don't have to get into all this stuff and a priori knowledge and things like that. But let's just keep it simple and say it's based off of observations and experiences. Okay. All right. So now moving on, let's cover scientific method. I'm sure you've studied scientific method before, so let's just go through it kind of quickly. But just want to remind you, because it's important in science that we follow the scientific method. I think people get kind of lost in scientists. Real scientists get kind of lost and do not think so clearly and reason so clearly because they are not following the scientific method. So it is important to stick with it. So, of course, the scientific method starts with observation. So what is science? First of all, science is kind of a methodical reasoning, right? Methodical meaning it follows a method. That's ordered towards truth. It's ordered towards discovering the truth, right? All science, if science doesn't have truth, it's garbage. Science that doesn't focus on the truth or doesn't reveal the truth or reveal the true underlying natural principles that govern the universe, it's junk. It's total garbage. And that could be said actually for any academic discipline. If it's not related to the truth or it's not based on the truth, it's just trash. It doesn't matter. So it's all ordered towards the truth, like all reason is. All reasoning is ordered towards truth. So, but it's not just truth about any truth, right? We're not focused on all truth. We're focused on the physical universe, the natural universe. Okay, nature. In other words, nature. And it's like I said, it's based off observation, so it's empirical. Okay, so we're trying to discover the truth about nature based off of the natural world, based off of observation. That's what science basically does. Okay, in a nutshell. So, like I said, we focus on the natural physical world. Okay. So now you might ask. I know a lot of my students in class do. I don't know. I'm sure you have questions too, but a lot of my students in class ask, well, what is not kind of the nature of the physical world? So let me explain a little bit about that. So science is focused, like I said, on the physical world, the physical universe. Okay, and that means things that consist of matter, energy, time. They exist in time and space. Okay, that's what it means. They exist in time and space. They have composed of matter and energy and things like that. Right. So if we study a human being, for example, scientifically, you'll understand the body, the organs, the tissues, and all that. But of course, if that's all you knew about a human being, you would be missing something, right? What if somebody wanted to write about you and write a story about you or a biography about you so that other people could understand, and all they focused on was like the atoms of your body, Sean, the professor Sean Hurt, he was composed of carbon atoms and hydrogen atoms and oxygen atoms, and he existed at this latitude and longitude at this time period. And obviously you would be missing something really big about who Sean Hurd is or who you are, right? So that kind of starts with showing you the limitations of science. And again, it points out to that base etymological root and difference that we talked about between sapientia and scientia, science and wisdom. Okay, so two different concepts of knowledge. So let's just talk about some things that, for example, don't exist. They're important, but they don't exist in time and space, and they're not composed of matter and energy. Some things like that, I kind of pointed out, like, your personality or your soul or who you are in essence, right? Like I said, if somebody wrote a biography about you and only talked about your elemental composition of atoms, they would be missing something about you, right? There'd be a big something they're not seeing there, right? So I just kind of put there generally the soul, or your essence, or who you really are, who something really is, right? Other things, though, logic, for example, are not based off of the physical world. They exist, they're real, but they're outside the physical world. Your mind is not physical, right? You have a brain. Of course, your brain is physical, and there's obviously a connection between your brain and your mind. There's no doubt about that. But your brain and your mind are not the same thing. Your consciousness and your mind are something that exists outside of just atoms and time and energy and space, right? Math is also something that is real. It exists. There's truths that we can outline about what it is and how it works, but it's not based off of the physical world and nature and natural laws. Okay, that's outside of it. There's a lot that could be said about this, and of course there are whole courses that are completely devoted to the subject that we're talking about right now. And I invite any kind of questions you might have. I know when I talk about this in my face-to-face class, people have a lot of questions. But anyway, moving along, science is, of course, it's methodical reason, it's oratory. So it's focused on the natural world. It follows the scientific method. Like I said, it's important to follow that scientific method. So you've got to remember that all science is based off of observation. That's what we outlined in the beginning here, right? So it's empirical. So all the scientific method, all science, it starts with an observation. So it starts with kind of a, that's funny. I wonder why that happens. You make an observation, something you see in nature, and you say, I wonder why that happens. I don't understand that. Why does it work that way? That's how science begins. So it begins with an observation. It begins kind of like with a question. I wonder why this happens. So just kind of, for example, why do the leaves here in Corpus Christi and especially other places, we don't get lovely fall colors like this really, but other places do. But why do the leaves fall off the trees in wintertime during fall? So that's a question we might have, right? And we want to explain why that happens or how that happens. So it kind of begins with I wonder, kind of a wonder about nature. So the next step to it then is we want to propose a hypothesis to explain our initial observation, to try to explain why the leaves fall off the trees in winter. So for example, people might obviously, if I asked you, why do you think the leaves fall off the trees in wintertime and fall, starting in fall? Why do you think that happens? And you might just just using your own intuitions and experiences, your empirical observations and experiences, you might just hypothesize that it has to do with it getting cold in the winter. So maybe the trees shed their leaves because it gets cold, and the cold kind of triggers something with the trees, and they say, okay, it's time to lose our leaves, okay? So that's hypothesis one, right? But there's something else. For example, when I talk about my students about this question in class, other students might realize that it's not just it gets cold during the winter and starting in the fall, right? It also starts to get darker. You know that the days get shorter. That's not so pronounced here in Corpus Christi, but especially if you live further north, or maybe if you've lived up further north, it gets more and more pronounced as you live further and further north, or further and further away from the equator. So anyway, hypothesis number 2 might be the days get shorter, and that's what triggers the leaves to fall off the trees, right? So anyway, our third step then is we want to make a prediction. One of the questions I ask on the test is I make sure that you know the difference between a hypothesis and a prediction, because a lot of people get that confused. I hear a lot of people say, kind of people that haven't had a science class, I guess, say, what do you hypothesize is going to happen? What do you hypothesize is going to happen? That makes no sense, right? You don't hypothesize what's going to happen, you predict what's going to happen. A hypothesis is an explanation. It's a proposal for why I think this particular phenomenon occurs in nature. It's trying to establish a causation or a causal relationship. This happens because of X. Y happens because of X. A happens because of B. Okay, that's a hypothesis. A prediction is based off a hypothesis, but we are going a step further, and we're saying if my hypothesis is true, I predict this should happen if I do this. Okay, so for example, if it's true that trees lose their leaves in winter because it gets cold, if that's true, then a tree kept in a warm greenhouse over the winter and kept warm should not lose its leaves, right? So that's our prediction. We then want to test our prediction with an experiment. So we can take our trees or our plants, put them in a controlled environment, right, with a greenhouse that's heated, and we can carry out the experiment and just see if our prediction comes true or not. So if our prediction so the last step then is to analyze our results. So if our prediction comes true and we see that, yeah, right, the trees lose their leaves it's because it gets cold, because we see that if we put them in a greenhouse, they don't shed their leaves, okay? But if they do shed their leaves, regardless of if you put it in a greenhouse or not, then that shows you that we have to go back and kind of tinker with our hypothesis, because there's something wrong with our hypothesis. Okay, so make sure that you know for the test the difference between a hypothesis and prediction. So I put some more information there. You can see up on the screen. So I guess you're looking up there, but anyway, just as kind of go over that and make sure you know the difference between the two, and you can tell the difference between the two. Basically, hypothesis is, again, it's trying to establish a causal relationship so that we know to explain why something happens. Whereas a prediction is based off hypothesis. We're going to try to predict what's going to happen if our hypothesis is true or not. Okay. So anyway, a little bit more about observations. We have two kind of different categories of observation. And this is kind of getting into more like formally defining science and the criteria of science. So again, one of the important criterion of science is that it's observable. It's based off observation. Okay, so these are the 3 criteria that establish whether something is science or not. So these are the kind of 3 criteria you have to use to test whether, if you want to know, is this science or not science? Remember in the beginning, I told you, we're going to define science, and that means we're going to put limits. We're going to put science in a box and show the limits of science, okay? This is the box, okay? These are the criteria by which you're going to judge whether something is science or not, okay? Now the first of the criteria, is it observable? Okay, we have 2 kinds of different observations. We have quantifiable observations and quantitative observations, or I should say qualitative and qualitative. Quantitative, just like the name implies, are based on quantities, so measurements. You know that in science we like to measure things. Okay, that's a big part of science, is measuring things. So in quantitative observation, quantified observation, quantities, we're measuring quantities. And that could be anything. It could be temperature, or mass, or distance, or speed, or whatever. We measure something with an instrument, okay? Qualitative is not like that. These are kind of things that are maybe more, you could maybe say, subjective. So, for example, let's say you find a new species. You want to describe that species. You can't, for example, if you find a new species of frog or bird or something, you can't just give a bunch of numbers and measure a bunch of numbers and get a very good idea of what that frog or that bird is like, right? So you have to include things like, the shape, the color, the form. You draw pictures, you take pictures, you draw diagrams of it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there's certain things that you need to describe for a good observation that they're not really captured very well by numbers. So that is when we are focusing on qualities rather than quantities. So we're not measuring something, we're focusing on the qualities of it. And then that's called a qualitative observation. Okay. So anyway, what are some properties of the physical world? Going back to quantitative, what are some properties of the physical world that we can measure? So this we're going to study more about this when we do the metric system in the next lecture. But it's actually kind of interesting. I just want to bring this up because I think it's interesting. I don't think I have a question about it right here on this lecture assignment. But there's actually only 7 independent dimensions of the universe that can be measured. So those things are distance, time, mass, temperature, electrical charge, amount of a substance, and luminosity. Okay. So again, more about this when we study the metric system. But I just think it's interesting is that everything else besides that, for example, is just it's dependent upon these 7. So for example, that you can measure speed, right? But what is speed? Speed is just a distance over time, right? So it breaks down to one of those 7 independent dimensions of the universe, or measurable parts of the universe. So I just think it's interesting. There's only 7. You can't. There's not any more, right? Anyway, going on. So that's the first part of our box around science. To define science is it has to be observable. It has to be something you can see, touch, feel, smell, or detect somehow with an instrument or measure or something like that. Okay, so you have to be able to observe it. All right. The next part about this is kind of the most difficult for students to understand. So I'll do my best to explain it. Need a drink of coffee first, I guess. But it has to be falsifiable. So this theory of falsifiability is an important part of what it means to be science. Let me explain that. Sometimes falsifiability, the theory of falsifiability, the concept of falsifiability, it's called by different names. Sometimes it's called verifiability, falsifiability, refutability. But what it comes down to is this. For something to be science, you have to be able to either prove it is true or prove that it's false based off of an observation. You have to be able to prove that it's true or prove that it's false based off an observation. So, I'll give you an example. Let's say somebody said all swans are white. Is that science? It is science. It's falsifiable. We can prove that it's true, or we could prove that it's false. It happens to be that we can prove it's false in this case. It's false, and we can prove that it's false with an observation because there are actually black swans, right? There's species in Australia. If you go to the zoo, I know that they have them in the zoo in Brownsville. You can go and see black swans. You could prove that it's true, in this case, prove that it's false with an observation, with evidence. With evidence. Okay? That's an important part. You can't discard that. You can prove it's true or prove that it's false with evidence. Okay? Now, let me give you some more examples. Humor me here. I know this sounds silly, but it's supposed to be silly. Let's say that a scientist wanted to do a scientific study and verify his hypothesis that most bachelors are unmarried. Okay, he wants to do a scientific study to see if bachelors are unmarried. Is that really true? He's heard it's true, but he wants to verify that it's really true. How silly, right? That's stupid. Why is that stupid? Why is it stupid? Isn't it stupid, right, to apply science, to go and do all the trouble of a scientific study to verify if it's really true, if bachelors are unmarried or not? So he goes out and he does a study of different bachelors to see if they're married or not. He finds that they're all unmarried. That's stupid because, why? Being unmarried is part of what it means to be a bachelor. That's part of the definition. So what you see is that science cannot tell you about the meanings of words. They can't tell you anything about meaning. Meaning is something that is not observable and can't be verified, right? We can't go out and do a study and verify that being a bachelor means you're unmarried, because that's part of just philosophy and what we do. In, for example, philosophy, we talk about what it means to be and what the meanings of words are, okay? So anyway, that shows you that's not something that can be falsified by evidence or verified by evidence. It's not falsifiable. Okay. So anyway, another thing I could bring up here is math, right? Mathematical truths are true. They're real. Math is real. It's true, but you don't falsify it or verify it by evidence and observation, okay? Like, so, for example, 1 plus 1 equals 2, right? Right? 1 plus 1 equals 2, okay? Now, some things in nature follow that rule, but some things don't. For example, if you take a cup of salt and a cup of water, and you mix them together, do you have 2 cups of salt water? No. You have less than 2 cups. Maybe you have a cup and a half of salt water. Why? Because the salt dissolved into the water. So I'm just trying to show you that sometimes that 1 plus 1 additive rule of math applies in nature, and sometimes it doesn't. And that's why mathematical laws aren't derived from nature. They don't come from nature. You might know about them or know something about them from nature, but that doesn't mean that they're based off of nature or the physical universe. They're something independent and outside of nature, and they exist in that form or that respect. Okay, so math is not falsifiable. You can't falsify math with an observation. Okay. It doesn't, like, just think about it. Like, could you ever do an experiment that proved that 1 plus 1 does not equal 2? Could you ever do an experiment to do that? It could never happen because, well, part of the reason is that it's just true, but also because you don't verify mathematical truths that way. They're more based on, like, logic, right? And they would be true regardless of what the truths of natural laws are. All right, last thing is that scientific observations need to be reproducible. So we need to be able to reproduce experiments. So for example, if I did an experiment in my lab and I measured, for example, like I measured the density of water, and I found that the density of water is 1. It's 1 gram per cc. That's actually is the density of water, right? It's 1 gram per cc, 1 gram per cubic centimeter. Somebody else has to be able to come and verify and reproduce my results. So scientific truths have to be reproducible. Somebody has to be able to come and reproduce them. So one thing that here, and that's actually really interesting as it applies to this class, because this class is historical geology. There are a lot of people, this might surprise you, but there are a lot of people that would actually argue that this class is not a science class. It's not a science class. I know it's under the Department of Natural Sciences and they call it a science class, but there are some that would argue it's not a science class. Why? Because it has to do with this issue of reproducibility. So in order to be really science, it has to be reproducible. Well, what does that mean? Singular historical events are not reproducible. right? I can't do science and reproduce like Washington crossing the Delaware, right, on Christmas Day. I can't do that. It's a singular one-time event. And it's not reproducible. Therefore, when we talk about, for example, in this class, we'll talk about Pangea coming together. And we'll talk about Pangea splitting apart. But that was a one-time singular event. And there is no way for us to reproduce Pangea coming together and splitting apart. So, it's an open question in philosophy of science of whether this class, Historical Geology, really is a science class. Okay, it's kind of interesting. But anyway, just to sum it up, to be science, here's our box of science, right? This is what defines and delineates science. Has to be observable. Has to be based on physical observations. It has to be. That means it's observable. Okay. The next thing is falsifiable. Okay. Falsifiable, verifiable means that you can use physical observable evidence to prove that it's true or prove that it's false. Either one. And the last thing is that it's reproducible. That means that people can come along and reproduce your experiment, reproduce your observations, and get the same results. Okay? Just to give you some real life examples. Science and not science. Okay. Which part of the brain, science, which part of the brain is active when your girlfriend or your boyfriend walks into the room and you're in love? Okay. You can hook electrodes up to your brain and you can look at what parts of your brain light up when your beloved boyfriend or girlfriend walks into the room. Okay? We can do that. It's your brain. It's physical. It's made of atoms. It exists in time and space and blah, 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 blah. Okay? No problem. Science. Not science. What is love? Any what is question. What is love? What is a human being? What is, like, what is the meaning of life, right? Or things like that. Science can't answer those questions because they're not based on atoms and matter and energy and blah, 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 blah. Okay, so that's not a scientific question. We can answer science. It can tell you everything about the Delaware River in terms of its discharge, its width, its depth, its length, how much water is flowing in it, how much water it contains, blah, 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 blah. Okay, science can do that. We can measure it, and we can reproduce it, and we can falsify different observations about it. Okay? We can't tell you, though, for example, when did Washington, like I said, cross the Delaware River? Right? We can't tell you that because that's a historical event. It was a one-time event that nobody can reproduce. Okay? Science and not science. That's why history... Except for this class, this is like the one class that's an exception. History is not science, I guess, except for historical geology. And the reason is because we have to use scientific information, I guess, like geological information to tell us something about Earth history. We aren't going to use like historical documents written by humans to tell us about Earth history. But in the past they did, right? I mean, in the past they used Earth history was... what we thought we knew about it or did know about it was completely based off of historical documents written by people. All right, anyway, more about that later. But what is science? The surface area of the Earth. I can tell you the surface area of the Earth, right? That's a scientific question. But not science. What does 1 + 1 equal? I can't tell you that based off of science, based off of observations, right? So anyway, that tells you what is science. So now you know what is science. A little bit, I want to talk about number 6 and 7 on your lecture assignment. Those are kind of the challenge questions. So you have to come up with a question. I just want to clarify this. You have to come up with a question. Okay, let's put it up here. That is not science. That you cannot answer with science. Okay, don't focus on like technological limitations. Focus more here on kind of what's theoretically possible or impossible. Okay, so for example, science can't tell you. Some students will say things. I've noticed they'll say things like, what does like Jupiter smell like or something like that? Well, no one's ever been to Jupiter, so we don't know what it smells like, and that's clever, but that's actually a science, because we can, even though we haven't gone to Jupiter and actually smelled it, we can theoretically go there and do it. So focus on the theory and not kind of like technical or technological limitations that we happen to have right now, because in the future we might not have them. A lot of students here, I don't know why, I just want to say this, they want to say something about dreams. I don't know where they get this. They get it off Google or something, or Course Hero, or I don't know where they get this thing about dreams. Dreams are kind of in a gray area. Try to find something besides dreams for that one. And then another thing I'll just say students will say is that's not very good is aliens. And they'll say, well, we haven't discovered aliens yet. Okay, but yet, keyword yet, right? We can theoretically verify or falsify whether they exist with an observation. So don't put anything about aliens either. Number 7, it says, concerning your previous response, what makes it... So you have to, here, number 7, you have to mention one of those 3 criteria, at least one of those 3 criteria that we've already talked about, right? Those are the criteria by which you're going to judge whether it's science or not. So you have to say, it's not falsifiable because of this. It's not observable because of this. It's not reproducible because of this. Okay? That's what you have to answer there. So anyway, I'll put that over there. I want to get in a little bit now into what is historical geology. So I told you what's science. What are we going to study in this class, though, specifically? So historical geology, it's a field that uses geology and paleontology. That means the study of past life and study of rocks in the earth. And we're going to use those 2 techniques from geology and paleontology to try to examine the history of Earth. Okay. Other times this class is actually called Earth History. So, you could put it in a science, you could put it in history, right? It's kind of a combination of science and history. Just to be aware, we are going to study a lot of fossils. We're going to study a lot of past life. We're going to go over the changes in life over time. We're going to go over the changes in our planet over time. We're going to talk about deep time, right? You'll see that the universe is very old. The Earth is very old. And how do we know that? And we're going to go over the evidence of how we know that, why we think that. But anyway, yeah, the Earth is very, very old. So if you were to stretch out your hand, and let's say that your shoulder, right here, your shoulder is the beginning of Earth, and the tip of your finger is the present day. There's no life on Earth. The very first life on Earth maybe begins up here near your shoulder, but we only have basically very, very simple single-celled organisms all the way up into about the midway to your hand. So most of Earth history, it's all either no life or there's just simple single-celled life, like algae, basically pond scum, up until you get to about this point on your hand. Okay, dinosaurs don't even come around till like your knuckle of your middle finger here. Okay, so dinosaurs seem very recent, or sorry, very long time ago, but they're not. They're very recent, actually. So, but we need to talk about, since we're going to be talking about such big swaths of time, we kind of need to talk more about kind of like how we express time periods. So we actually have something called the geologic time scale. Because you're in historical geology, you're going to have to memorize a lot of this. You're not going to have to memorize the epochs here, but starting over here, you're going to have to start to memorize. But don't worry about that right now. But it's good to kind of start looking at this and getting used to it, because it's going to kind of guide us through our class as we go on. I do need to talk about units of time. So you'll see that number 10, number 11, number 12, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They have to do with... Actually, 10 and 11 have to do with units of time. So let's talk about this, because we use different units when we talk about time. Okay, first of all, little a. Okay, little a. Little a is Latin for annum. It means a year. Stands for the Latin word annum, which means a year. Okay, so you're going to see this a lot. Little a means annum. M-A, big M, little a, means mega annum. Not little m, little a. Okay, big M, little a. Case sensitive. Got it? Case sensitive. Big M, little a means mega annum. That means million years. G-A, big G, little a, means giga annum, billion years. Okay? M-Y-A means millions of years ago. B-Y-A means billions of years ago. K-Y-A means kilo. I don't know why they do. I don't know why it's not T-Y-A. It's weird. It's confusing. But it's K-Y-A, kilo, and kilo years ago, 1,000 years ago. So K of here, see K-Y-A means 1,000 years ago. Isn't that confusing? I don't know how these things happen, but they do. But anyway, look at this. There's a lot of ways to write the same thing. So for example, 1,000 MA is 1,000 million years. 1,000 million years is a billion years. So how could you write a billion years? Look at all the ways you could write a billion years. Okay, I'm going to write a billion years. 1 GA, giga annum. 1 BYA, 1 billion years ago. 1,000 MA, 1,000 million years ago. 1,000 mega annum. 1,000 MYA, 1,000 million years ago. It's a billion years. Other things I could also put. I know this you never see this, but you could put a million KYA, 1,000,000 years ago, because 1,000 million years is a billion, and 1,000,000 years is a billion, right? Anyway, that's a really annoying way to put it, and I would never put it that way, and no textbook puts it that way, but you need to be aware of it, okay? So 1,000 times 1,000 is a million. 1,000,000 times 1,000 is a billion. So 1,000 times 1,000 times 1,000, a billion. Anyway, you just have to get used to all this stuff. I'm sorry it's confusing, but that's why I have a lecture slide about this, because it's so confusing. You'll see it every different way. Different textbooks, different websites, you're going to see it in every different way. So you need to get used to how these years work out. Okay, geologic time, number 12. Geologic time is divided into 4 eons. So here are your eons right here. Get used to this stuff, okay? Phanerozoic. Welcome to the Phanerozoic. You're in the Phanerozoic right now. Before the Phanerozoic, there was the Proterozoic, then the Archean, and then the Hadean, okay? The Hadean ended 4 billion years ago. The Archean ended 2,500 million years ago. It's 2.5 billion years ago. The Proterozoic ended 542 million years ago, and now you're in the Phanerozoic, okay? So every geologic time is divided into 4 eons. Every eon is further divided into different eras. So the Phanerozoic, the Mesozoic, the Paleozoic. So Phanerozoic is split into Cenozoic, Mesozoic, Paleozoic. Okay. By the way, that just means recent animals, middle animals, old animals. Okay. Zoic, zoo, animal. Just means animal. Latin for animal. Paleo means old. Meso means middle. Ceno means recent. Okay. What are the 4 eons of geologic time from oldest to youngest? We already talked about that. What are the 3 eras of the Phanerozoic from oldest to youngest? Paleozoic. Mesozoic, that's the dinosaur age. Cenozoic, age of mammals. Okay, there you go. That's your intro to geologic time. That's your intro to this class, your first lecture. I hope you enjoyed it. Make sure you start studying your geologic time scale. Also, make sure you start your reading. I don't have too much reading in the first semester, but make sure that you have your book. I can get your book for you. Let me show you your book. Is it up here? Yeah, Changing Earth. I have it somewhere. I can't. I don't want to get it now. Well, oh, I see it. No, that's not it. I'm sorry. Never mind. I'm looking for my textbook for class. Okay. Anyway, Please let me know if you have any questions or comments. Please get a hold of me if you need help with the class, and I will talk to you next time in the next lecture. Thank you.